Ukraine. For 2 years, this body has had bipartisan consensus and unanimity on standing up to Russia, on stopping Nord Stream 2. It is only with a Democrat in the White House that suddenly scores of Democrats have decided partisan loyalty is more important than standing up to Russia. Partisan loyalty is more important than stopping Putin. Partisan loyalty is more important than standing with our European allies. And I would note, ironically, the White House's lead talking point is, quote, transatlantic unity. When the European Parliament voted on Nord Stream 2, it voted to condemn and shut down Nord Stream 2 by a vote of 585 to 50. 585 to 50. The White House is saying, stand with the 50. Stand with 9% of the European Parliament against 91% of the European Parliament. That makes no sense, and no Democrat uttering those talking points believes it. But there are too many Democrats who are deciding partisan loyalty matters more than standing with our allies. Partisan loyalty matters more than standing with our European friends. Partisan loyalty matters more than honoring our treaty commitments. Partisan loyalty matters more than protecting the national security of the United States. For 5 years, Democrats have uttered the words, Russia, Russia, Russia. We will now learn whether they meant those words when they said them. Or was that simply animus for President Trump? We should stand together. If a Republican were in the White House, Mr. President, every Democrat in this chamber would vote to sanction Nord Stream 2. The only reason not to do so is because for some Democrats, partisan loyalty matters more than standing up to Russia or defending our national security. Let me finally say, if the Senate votes down these sanctions in just a few minutes, it will effectively give a green light to Putin. That's what the leaders of civil society in Ukraine have told us. And if, as a result of the Senate's vote, if the Democrats vote with Russia, with Putin, we may well see in the days or weeks or few months ahead Russian tanks in the streets of Kiev. And every senator, Democrat or Republican, will remember this moment we had to stop the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And those senators that put our obligations to our friends, our obligations to our nation, our obligations to security above partisan loyalty, they will remember that. And those senators that didn't, they will remember that. The eyes of history are on the Senate. There are moments, particularly dealing with war and peace, where the consequences of our actions echo throughout the decades. This moment is one of them. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Idaho is recognized.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to speak for up to 5 minutes, followed by Senator Menendez to speak for up to 10 minutes before the scheduled roll call vote on this bill.
Is there objection?
Reserving the right to object. I'm sorry, Mr. President, I didn't hear the unanimous consent request.
I think it was just a minute or two for you and the rest for me, Senator.
Then I object to that.
I'd ask for 5 minutes for myself and 10 minutes for yourself. Is that sufficient?
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, fellow senators, I rise today to speak on behalf of Cruz-Rich Nord Stream 2 bill, which is designated as Senate Bill 3436. To start with, it's important to note that this bill has language which is almost identical to the language that was contained in the Senate and House passed National Defense Authorization Act. Both bodies passed this language. It was unfortunately taken out in the workup of that bill before it went to the White House in the reconciliation. And, but now this language is back before us in this bill. And what it would do, it would immediately sanction Nord Stream 2, Putin's premier energy weapon against Europe and the Ukraine particularly. The timing could not be more important. Ukraine stands on the brink of invasion, and Europe is in the throes of an energy crisis created by Russia. There's a reason Ukraine's President Zelensky tweeted an urgent request in December for all friends of Ukraine and Europe in the United States Senate to back these sanctions. That request is before us at this moment. We are now seeing the consequences of the administration's decision to waive PISA sanctions and refusal to impose CAATSA sanctions. Months ago, the administration set the stage for this mess on the Ukraine's border and emboldened Putin. Russia has deliberately cut gas transmission to Europe through Ukraine and is using high energy prices to pressure the European Union into approving Nord Stream 2 as quickly as possible. Putin has publicly stated that fact. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue their buildup along the border with Ukraine in preparation for what could be a full-scale invasion. Clearly, the administration's efforts have failed to signal credibility and resolve and have not deterred Putin from continuing along the path to war. U.S. diplomacy needs additional action, not just rhetoric, to stop a Russian invasion. And these sanctions would provide that by putting Congress in charge of waiver authority. A vote for these sanctions will provide credibility to our threat, sending a strong message to Putin. Remember, Nord Stream 2 is designed to replace Ukraine's gas transit system, meaning Russia no longer has to worry about destroying its own infrastructure in the event of a full-scale war. We must not allow Putin's blackmail to succeed. Nord Stream 2 has always been a bipartisan issue here in the Senate, and it should continue to be. Not a single member of Congress supports the completion of this pipeline. I'd like to think a similar number of us feel we should not ignore our friends in Europe, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, who stand to lose the most from Nord Stream 2. Our bill would impose mandatory sanctions against Nord Stream 2 AG, the company responsible for the project, as well as the companies involved in testing and certifying the pipeline before it becomes operational. We do provide the administration with a pathway to lifting these targeted sanctions pending congressional review. This pathway is the exact same process for congressional input that 98 senators voted for in CAATSA just a few years ago. The time to act is now. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President,
The senator from New Jersey is recognized.
I ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to complete my remarks before the vote begins.
Without objection. Is there objection? Without objection.
Mr. President, this is a pivotal week for the security of Ukraine. Talks are ongoing to test whether the Kremlin wants to engage in diplomacy or intent on war, to see if the United States and our allies can pull Putin back from the brink. And if the headlines are any indication this morning, it's clear that this is an open question. This is a critical time. There still may be a window to deter the Kremlin from deciding to invade, but we must be clear and united about what awaits Russia if it chooses the unwise path. We must send an unequivocal message that should Putin invade, the consequences would be devastating, that there would be steep cost to the economy and to the people of Russia if he further tramples on Ukraine's territory and independence. That message should be sent through every channel at every level, including by this body. And we have a chance to do just that. The Defending Ukraine's Sovereignty Act, which has just 2 short days, 39 co-sponsors already, is a comprehensive response to the threat facing Ukraine. It would impose massive, crippling sanctions on multiple sectors of Russia's economy. It would impose the harshest sanctions on Putin and senior Kremlin officials themselves. It would effectively cut Russia off from the international financial system. That's the sanctions that I helped devise that ultimately brought Iran years ago to the negotiating table. This act also makes clear that the United States will make every effort to expedite security assistance and defense articles to help support Ukraine. And it expands our efforts to counter Kremlin aggression across the region. It says the United States will not stand for this bullying. And it makes clear that Putin has a choice to make. But we are not voting on that comprehensive response. We're now voting, we're not voting, I should say, on how severe the consequences should be if Putin goes down the path of invasion. Instead, we are voting on whether to sanction Nord Stream 2, as if that alone would deter Putin from reinvading, as if that alone would stop him. Instead, Mr. President, sanctioning Nord Stream now, at this pivotal moment, would have the opposite effect of deterring Putin. It might even be the excuse Putin is looking for. Right now, the one thing we know Putin wants is for Nord Stream 2 to be operational. Now, let's be clear. If we don't sanction Nord Stream now, that does not mean the pipeline goes online. It does not mean that Putin gets his way. What it does mean is that there's leverage. Right now, we have a new German government that has blocked the pipeline from moving forward. Right now, that German government is a productive partner with us on this critical issue. They are where we need them to be, working to coerce Putin not to reinvade Ukraine, making clear that if Putin advances into Ukraine, there will be no Nord Stream, working with us to strengthen and support strong deterrence, coordinating with us to enhance the impact of devastating sanctions if we need to pull that trigger. That is where we need the German government to be. Sanctioning Nord Stream now, in the way that the Cruz bill would do, would not just be a sanction on Nord Stream 2 AG. The bill would sanction, quote, any corporate officer of any entity established for or responsible for the planning, construction, operation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline or a successor entity, close quote. This broad scope would have a clear ripple effect on the entities, many of them German, and individuals, many of them German citizens, who worked on the pipeline. That includes German companies involved in the pipeline, industrial sites, rail operators, port operators, and any entity associated with that deal. So for an ally that is with us in this fight against Putin's aggression, for an ally that is standing up with us when we need them to be strong, this would be akin to a sanction on them. They have made that clear to us. Now is not the time to take that step. Again, the pipeline today is paused. They basically stopped the regulatory process on it. At the earliest, it could be months before anything happens, depending upon what Putin does. Depending upon what Putin does, and even if they allow it to move forward. Now is not the time to take off the table a key piece of leverage. Now, Mr. President, I have to address some other points I've heard some of our colleagues mention. I've listened to the senator from Texas attempt to lay blame time and time again at the feet of President Biden. He's tried to blame President Biden for Nord Stream, and now he's trying to blame him for Putin's illegitimate power grabbing and military aggression. But you know what? I suggest he look back and review just how and when Nord Stream came to be. Because it wasn't President Biden who could have imposed sanctions back in 2017. It wasn't President Biden who did nothing for years while 94% of the pipeline was being built. It wasn't President Biden who waited until his last day in office to impose sanctions on Nord Stream. Mr. President, there was someone else who could have used his authority to put a stop to this malign influence project, but didn't. There was someone else who could have made the Kremlin's weaponization of energy a priority, but didn't. The senator already knows this. But how can I be so sure? Because he said so at the time. In December of 2019, he said, and I quote, "I want this to be very clear. If the pipeline is completed, it will be the fault of members of this Trump administration who sat on their rear ends and didn't exercise the clear power. The fault of the Trump administration," his words. But now, magically, it's President Biden's fault. Please, pipeline that was 94% complete by January of 2021, to me, that's a Trump-Putin pipeline. And Mr. President, it may be convenient to say that work on the pipeline stopped until Biden became president, but that's just not the case. In fact, work stopped on the pipeline for 6 months. 6 months from December of 2019 until the spring of 2020 because a company backed out of the project. But did Russia stop? No. It was working furiously to finish the job by retrofitting ships that complete the pipeline. And the moment that was done, the moment the ships were ready, pipeline construction started again. A retrofitted Russian ship, the Kyrsten, showed up in Germany on May of 2020, awaiting a permit by Danish authorities. The permit was approved in October of 2020. The fact that it received a permit was sanctionable by the then Trump administration. The Trump administration failed to act. On December 11th, Nord Stream 2 AG said that the Fortuna resumed offshore construction activities in shallow German waters. Nord Stream 2 AG was not waiting for Biden to be in office. It was acting. The Trump administration could and should have imposed sanctions under CAATSA at that point. As a matter of fact, it didn't need CAATSA. It had IEEPA sanctions that it could have imposed and chose not to do. So now look, my position on Nord Stream has been clear. I have been and remain strongly opposed to the pipeline. I supported sanction measures on the project when they could have had an impact during the Trump administration, before hundreds of miles of pipe had been completed. And President Trump had those tools. He had them. We passed them overwhelmingly. And then we gave him more tools and more sanctions. And what did he do? Nothing. Not until his last day in office did he impose sanctions on Nord Stream, his very last day. So let's stop with the games. By the time the Biden administration took office, the pipeline was 94% complete, 94%. Senator Cruz wants to stop the pipeline, so do I. But it is far from clear that sanctions at this point, when the pipeline is already built, will do just that. In fact, it isn't clear to me at all that the senator's proposal would even change the status quo. Instead, it would most certainly tie up this body and this floor so that we'd be voting time and time again on resolutions of disapproval related to Nord Stream. Now, of course, I get it. I get it. I understand why the senator would rather tie up this floor and hamstring the president's agenda instead of voting on nominees or voting rights or Build Back Better or judges or a whole host of other critical elements before the country. But that's the reality of the senator's proposal. So I asked my colleagues, what is the urgent threat that needs addressing? Is it attempting to score political points and tie this president's hands intentionally and internationally? Or is it addressing the very real and potentially imminent threat amassing among Ukraine's border? I believe we need to address the real threat and the whole threat facing Ukraine and the region. And that's why I drafted the Defending Ukraine's Sovereignty Act. Sovereignty Act. I've stood up for and alongside Ukraine time and time again in the face of Kremlin aggression. In 2014, I was in Ukraine right after Russia's invasion took place. After Russia's illegal occupation of Crimea, I drafted the Ukraine Freedom Support Act, which passed into law to impose sanctions on Russia and increase support for Ukraine. In 2016, I introduced the Stand for Ukraine Act to help restore Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of Kremlin aggression. And I will continue to ensure that the United States does all that it can to help Ukraine defend itself against Putin's bullying, to provide the assistance it needs, to support its integrity, and to bolster its security in the region. And I urge this body to do just that. Now, finally, Senator Cruz would like to suggest that partisan loyalty is why we believe his approach at this time is wrong. What is wrong is to break the coalition we now have against Putin at one of the most critical times of Ukraine's history. Germany is a critical part with us, an ally with us to deter Putin. Yeah, Nord Stream today, not that this legislation would, one less reason for Putin to say, well, that's gone, why shouldn't I invade anyhow? I urge my colleagues to address the actual imminent threat amassing along Ukraine's border, to make clear to Putin what the massive costs of his actions will be. We might still be able to turn Putin back, but we must be laser focused on what it will take to get him from taking one more step towards Ukraine's border. I urge my colleagues to act to address the threat at hand, one that extends far beyond a pipeline, but threatens an entire country's borders and the security of a region. It is a threat that demands a comprehensive, resounding response. That is what we will be offering in short order. So I urge my colleagues to vote no on this approach, to make sure we keep the unity that is essential at this time to deter Putin, and to work with me to make sure that this body sends the united, strong message to deter Putin, stand with our allies, and support Ukraine. I urge a no vote on the Cruz legislation, and I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, all time is expired. The clerk will read the title of the bill for the third time.
Counter number 231, S3436, a bill to require the imposition of sanctions with respect to entities responsible for the planning, construction, or operation of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and so forth and for other purposes.
The question is on the bill. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Braun, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mrs. Gillibrand. Sir, thank you. This is. Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Lankford, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Portman, Mr. Reed, Mr. Risch, Mr. Romney, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, yep, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Sass, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Sinema, Ms. Smith, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Cassidy, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Murkowski, Thune, and Young. Senators voting in the negative: Carper, Duckworth, King, Manchin, Markey, Menendez, Peters, Smith, Stabenow, and Van Hollen. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Cortez Masto, no. That was a yes, I'm sorry. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Ossoff, no. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, no. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Merkley, no. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Cardin, no. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Daines, aye. Ms. Sinema, aye. Mr. Tuberville, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Oh, love your jacket. Yes, yes. Mr. Grassley, aye. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Kramer, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Murphy, no. No? Ms. Sinema, no. Mr. Tester, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Durbin, no. Mr. Heinrich, no. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Brown, no. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Lummis, aye. Mr. Leahy, no. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mrs. Feinstein, no. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Kane, no. Mr. Haggerty, aye.